All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, for dedicating all of the Shur Ben Drashos this month in the Schos of Refuah Shalema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira, the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shur Ben Drashos this month in honor of the Simchas of our children, wishing everyone much happiness, mazel, bracha, and a shana tova u'mesuka. To thank Avram and Shindy Kelman for dedicating all the Shur Ben Drashos this month in memory of their beloved parents and in the schus of all those who need a refuah shalema. Daf Yomi today, the shir is sponsored by Matt and Rishona Libovitz in honor of their father Mark Libovitz on his big birthday today. Wow, mazel tov. Mazel tov, Mark, on Meh ve'esim shanim tovos. It is a joy. I'm going to read the rest of it because it's very beautiful. It is a joy and a privilege to learn and grow together, and we hope to continue ad mea ve'esrin. So truly beautiful, incredible, incredible. All right, beautiful. So, okay, so today's daf is Yud Ches 18. We are picking up on Yud Zayin Beis 17b, and we are picking up 15 lines up from the bottom at the two dots, or in the wide lines. It's four lines into the wide lines. So the Mishnah, so the Brisa, and we're actually dissecting a little bit of a Brisa that we spoke about in yesterday's daf. So the Brisa says as follows: Hanirtza v'hanimkar la'oved kochavim eino oved loas haben v'loas habas. So nirtza, pierced eved, decides to stay on after 6 years. Nimkar la'oved kochavim, or an eved ivri who is sold to a Gentile master, and the master dies. Ultimately, again, the Eved Ivri does not serve the daughter or the son, okay, of the master. So Nirtza, how do I know about a Nirtza? D'chsev v'ratza adonav es azna b'maznea b'martzea v'avadol yoma. The pasuk says the master will pierce his ear with a martzea, with an awl, and he will serve him forever, the olam. Lo, v'loas haben es habas. He serves the master and not the son or the daughter of the master. Okay, so Rabbi says, so it's just simply exeris hakasiv. So therefore, again, the pierced eved, if his master dies, he does not go to the son or the daughter. Instead, he goes free. Next, nimkar la'ovid kochav minayin. What about there's an eved ivri who is sold to an akum, and then the akum dies. The akum dies. How do we know that the servant doesn't serve the son or the daughter? So the Gemara says, Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kra, v'chishav im konehu, v'lo miyorshay konehu. He will literally, chishav im konehu means like you'll calculate the remaining years with the one who acquired him, and not with the heirs of the one who acquired him. Okay, so Amar Rava, Dvar Torah, both say this is actually a fascinating sugya. Dvar Torah, Ovid kochavim yoresh es aviv. Listen to this, both say, Midaraisa, an Ovid kochavim, a Gentile, inherits his father. So we'll say, so this is about now a non-Jewish family. They have a non-Jewish family, right? So we have father, son. So the Gemara is suggesting over here now, Rav is suggesting that midda oraisa, a son inherits his father. Shnei amar v'chishav im koneu v'lo im yarshe koneu. Because we will say the fact that by Eved Ivri, the Torah says that when he has a Gentile master, you calculate out the number of years, right, in order to establish redemption. The fact that it says koneu v'lo im yarshe koneu, we just made a drasha that this only applies to the Gentile master, not to his heirs. Michlal the Isla Yarshim. So as you see here what's happening over here? The fact that we need to say that if the master of the Eved Ivri dies, the Gentile master dies, that the Eved Ivri doesn't serve his heirs, what can you infer from that statement? That a Gentile has heirs. So you see from here that midda oraisa, there is a concept of inheritance even by non-Jews. So first of all, in other words, it's just a fascinating idea. In other words, the halachos of Yerusha that we have govern the relationship between Jews. Now, Rabbi says, by the way, the concept of a son inheriting a father also applies by non-Jews as well. Fascinating. Geras ha'ovid kochavim. Listen to this, Rabbi say. What about a ger? So let's say you have a fine situation. You have father, and son. Gentile father, Gentile son. Son converts. Son converts. Now, sometime later on, father, Gentile father, dies. So does that son inherit his father? Now, both say your reflexive answer is No, because Gershin is Katan Shinolodami, part of the dynamic of conversion is a rebirth, and part of that dynamic is essentially a severing of familial relationships with everyone else who was part of your biological family. But listen to this. So the Gemara says a ger inherits his Gentile father, not biblically, but rabbinically. So midrabanan, ultimately again a ger inherits his father. This nan ger va'oved kochavim shi'ar savim oved kochavim. So let's imagine the following situation: you have father, non-Jewish. Father has two sons. We'll call them A and B. B becomes Jewish. Now father dies. So what happens? So now you have two brothers. One is Jewish, one is not Jewish. Shi'ar savim, and now they're inheriting their father. Oved kochavim, of ger yachol lomer le'oved kochavim, tol ata avodas kochavim, vani maos, tol ata yayin nesech, vani peros. Let's say, now what happens? In the estate, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Let's say that, right? So Gentile father died, he left behind a beautiful wine cellar. The problem is it's wine owned by a non-Jew. It's yayin esech, or maybe even better, he was a religious man. So he left behind a wine cellar of sacramental wine, right? So what happens? So Jewish brother, could say to his Gentile brother, listen, you take the wine, I'll take the cash, right? Or dad died, he was an avid idol collector, right? So he has a very valuable idol collection. You take the idols, I'll take the cash. However, again, the problem is if by some reason the ger inherits these items, let's say, for example, for whatever the reason he took possession of the wine, he can't barter that afterwards, because if he barters it afterwards, then he's getting benefit from idolatrous items. So and if you thought that a ger inherits his father midaraisa, kilo now if biblically a ger inherited his father, that means that the moment the father dies, the ger inherits everything. Because we always say that's the way inheritance works. Remember, when a father dies, and let's say you have multiple sons, everyone inherits everything. They then have to go ahead and divide out, but everyone becomes an instantaneous owner over everything. If that's the case, if a ger would inherit his father midaraisa, the moment the father dies, the ger inherits everything. Any subsequent bartering would then be considered to be getting benefit from idolatrous items, right? Ella midrabanan. So we'll say ultimately again it says dirabanan. So we'll say, so I just want to point out something amazing. Even before this Gemara, we know that a ger does not inherit his father midaraisa. We know that. We know that because, as we said before, when a person converts to a certain degree, it's a strong statement, but again, those familial bonds are severed. Those familial bonds are severed. It's not a halachic relationship anymore between those two individuals. So also what the Gemara is introducing us to is midrabanan. This is fascinating. So the rabbi stepped in, and the rabbi said, no, a ger can inherit his father who is an idolater, an akum. He just has to be careful about the way in which he inherits it. Why did Chazal enact this? Rabbi said, this is incredible. Rabbi said, what were Chazal concerned about? Chazal were concerned that if you do not allow the ger to inherit his father, what's going to happen? He's going to essentially renounce his Judaism, go back to his idolatrous ways, because ultimately, again, he stands to lose a lot of money. In other words, Rabbi say, in order to ensure that the ger does not feel a pull to go back to his idolatrous origins for financial benefit, Chazal instituted or legislated that he inherits his father. So Rabbi say, this is such an incredible idea, and Rabbi say, herein lies. So hear what's happening over here. So midaraisa, a ger does not inherit his father. Midrabanan, Chazal said, yes, he does. Because we're concerned that if we don't allow him to inherit his father, again, let's say his father was incredibly wealthy. So now what are you doing? You're making the ger choose between what? Choose between his God and his money. Don't make people choose between God and money. Because 9 out of 10 times, they're choosing money. I would say it's such an incredible thing. And herein lies the beauty of Yiddishkeit. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. Eitz chaimi l'machazikim, but the Torah is a Torah of life. The Ribono Shel Olam understands us. Halacha understands us. And that's why you see these examples of not wanting to put people in acute positions of having to choose between spirituality and ultimately wealth, because we're people. We're people, and money is money, and money is alluring, and wealth is alluring. And so, again, it's incredible. So Chazal said, okay, let him inherit his father. Okay, there are limitations. There are limitations. Also, remember where else we saw this? Remember back we saw this quoted in Ksuvas as well, in Gittin as well, Takanas Hashavin, right? That although when you steal something, you are supposed to go ahead, if the object itself doesn't exist, you're supposed to go ahead and repay the object. Remember again, we saw the example of the beam, of the thief who stole the beam, built it into his home. So what did Chazal say? What did Chazal say? Keep the beam, pay the value. But it's right there every single time you walk into the house. The stolen beam is there. If you make the ganav deconstruct his home in order to do tshuva, what's going to happen? He's not going to do tshuva. He's not going to do tshuva. It's such an incredible yisod. Anyway, let's go right there. So the Gemara goes right. The Gemara says, that supports this. When is this true? Ultimately, that a ger inherits his father. So the Gemara says, "Kishi yarshu aval kinishtatfu asur." Or when? So I'll say all of this is only true. Ultimately, again, in the case of halacha l'maisa of inheritance. With a partnership, it would be much more complicated. In other words, if you had a Jew who was in a partnership, ultimately, again, with a Gentile, and there was forbidden assets involved in that, the dissolution of that partnership is going to be much more complicated. Again, not our topic for today. The point of Rebbe said that we want to point out, just remember how we got to this. We got to this because, again, an Eved Ivri who is owned by a Gentile, if the Akum master dies, he is not inherited by the master's son or daughter. From here you see that mid'oraisa there is a concept of inheritance by non-Jews. We then use it as a segue to say also a convert child inherits his Gentile father midrabanan, not mid'oraisa, in order that the convert child should not chas v'shalom feel a pull to return back to his idolatrous origins in order to financially benefit. Incredible. Ovid kochavim esager, the ger sa ovid kochavim, ein lo midivrei Torah v'lo midivrei sof. This is interesting. So we'll say, so what happens if the father is a ger? So we'll say in this case over here you have father and son, father had a family, then father converted. Father converted afterwards. So the father is Jewish, right? The father is Jewish, the son is not. The son is not. So in that case, there's no inheritance, right? The Gentile son does not inherit the Jewish father. The Geras Hager, similarly again, I will say is actually interesting. If father and son converted independently, there's no Yerusha, there's no inheritance in that case as well. Not rabbinically, not biblically, not rabbinically. Disnan, because we learned, Lava Ma'os Minager Shenis Gairu Banov, if you went ahead and you borrowed money from a ger, from a person who converted, and by the way, his children also converted, Lo Yachzir Labanov. So we'll say, so now remember again, let's say now, so we'll call them father and son. All adults. Father converted, sons also converted independently. Now what happens? I borrow money from father, who's a ger. Father dies. There is no obligation to go ahead and return that money to the father's sons. Why? Because we'll say, since everyone converted, therefore what? There's no familial connection between those individuals. So there's no obligation to return the money to the sons because the sons are not considered to be his heirs. Therefore, no obligation to return the money. And if you did return the money to the children, ultimately Chazal don't like that, which is interesting. Chazal don't like it. We'll say, so ein ruacham nocha imenu means, Rashi says, ein das chacham nocha aleim b'masav, kilomar ein machzikin latova shelo tzrichu lekach. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to return that money to the convert children, since those convert children are not his heirs. So the Gemara says, but we learned elsewhere that Chazal are happy with a person who returns the money to the convert children. Lokasha, kansha rasa v'leidaso shelo b'kedusha, top of Yudches, kansha rasa shelo b'kedusha v'leidaso b'kedusha. Both say one case is talking about where the convert children were both conceived and birthed before the father was Jewish. If ultimately, again, the children were conceived and birthed before the father was Jewish, then there's really no connection, halachic connection, so to speak, between father and children, and therefore there's no obligation to return the money to the children. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa, let's say the conception of the children was before the father converted, but by the time they were born, the father converted, then in that case, again, there would be an idea of returning the money to the children afterwards. Incredible. Okay, so I'll say the Gemara happens to see there's a lot of interesting halachic discussions about families converting like that. What happens when you have intact families who convert together? What is the status? Right? In other words, you have a father, a mother, and two kids, right? And now everyone converts together as a family unit. What is this halachic status of ours? Does that family unit remain intact or not? Is a whole discussion. Anyway, let's go back there. 18a, second line down. Rabbi Yochanan, Ovid Kochavim Yoreshes of Dvar Torah. An Ovid Kochavim goes ahead and inherits his father. Mid'oraisa. We'll say, so this is two Gentiles now. Two Gentiles. Dechsiv Kirusha Nasati es Har Seir. We'll say, so interestingly enough, the Torah says, I have given a Yerusha to Esav, Har Seir. Esav's not Jewish. Esav's not Jewish, right? I've given ultimately, again, Esav a Yerusha of Har Seir. So you see from here, and remember, that's passed down from Esav to his children. So you see from here that an Oved Kochavim ultimately inherits his father. I, the Dilma Yisrael Mummer Shiny. We'll say, well, Esav's not a Gentile, right? Esav is the son of Yaakov. So maybe a Yisrael Mummer, right? Maybe, a heretic Yisrael, right? An apostate Yisrael ultimately is different. In other words, we'll say, isn't this incredible? The Gemara says, how can you call Esav an Akum? Esav is not an Akum. Esav is Yisrael. Okay, maybe he's a shtickle mummer, right? He's a little bit of an apostate, a little bit of a heretic, right? But we all have our mummer days. Well, it happens to all of us, right? So l'maisa, but don't call him an Akum. Don't call him an Akum. So profound. We'll say, by the way, I just want to point out, what a message of chizuk, right? It's Elul. And this is the time of year, right? Tshuva, trying to get ourselves together. And so many times we think that we are beyond salvation, right? That's it, I'm done. You should see, if the Gemara comes to the defense of Esav, right, and gets offended by calling Esav an Akum. Esav is not an Akum. Esav is a mummer. It gives us so much chizuk that we could pull ourselves together as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Elamihacha, kilivnei Lot nasati es er Yerusha. So we'll say, the pasuk says, I've given to the sons of Lot, I've been given to the sons of Lot, the city of Ar. So the Gemara says, okay, so here you see Lot is not Jewish, and you see again that there's Yerusha. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara is happier with that approach, because Lot, Lot, although he was a nephew of Avram Avinu, at the end of the day is considered to be not Jewish. Rav Chia bar Avin, my time Allah Marka Rabba. So why doesn't Rav Chia bar Avin say like Rabba? So the Gemara says, Miksiv v'chishav im koneu, v'lo im yashar koneu. Does it say? In other words, I will say, so ultimately, again, that pasuk of V'chishav im koneo, which was the source for Rava, so again, Rav Chia bar Avin will say, it doesn't say anything about Yarshim. The Rava, my time, lo amar Rav Chia bar Avin. Why doesn't Rava hold like Rav Chia bar Avin? So the Gemara says, Mishum kivodo da Avraham shiny. You can't learn out anything from Lot, because the fact that at the end of the day, Lot's descendants inherit might not have anything to do with the fact, in other words, that might not point to the fact that there is inheritance law by Gentiles. That might just be what? Something that was done out of deference and covered to Avram Avinu. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, let's go back to Eved Ivri. Tanrabanan, Yesh be'Eved Ivri she'ein be'Ivriya, v'yesh be'Ivriya she'ein be'Ivri. So now the Bride says as follows, there are certain things that apply to an Eved Ivri that do not apply to an Amma Ivriya, and certain things to an Amma Ivriya that don't apply to an Eved Ivri. Here we go. Yesh be'Ivri shu yotze b'shanim u'biyovam misasa adon. So I'll say, we're going to see this price really is going to require an incredible amount of elucidation. So watch this. So the Gemara says, what happens with an Ivri? What happens with an Ivri? So an Ivri goes out after 6 years, goes out by Yovel, right, if he's a pierced Eved, and ultimately goes out with the death of the master. Masha'en came be Ivriya. That doesn't apply to an Amma Ivriya. All right, so after what does it mean it doesn't apply to an Amma Ivriya? V'yesh be'Ivriya shari Ivriya yotze b'simanim. Ultimately, an Amma Ivriya ultimately goes out with signs of physical maturation. Ve'ina nimkeres v'nishnes. This is interesting. An Amma Ivriya cannot be sold twice. cannot be sold twice. Once you are sold as an Amma Ivriya and somehow you experience emancipation, you cannot be resold. In other words, the father can't resell his daughter. Umaftin osa bal karcho, we could redeem her against his will. Again, we're not exactly sure what that means either. Masha'in came be'ivri, and this doesn't apply to an eved ivri. All right, so we'll say now let's dissect this brisa. Amar yesh be'ivri she'in be'ivriya. So we'll say, so the first part of the brisa read a little bit strange, right? The first part of the brisa says there are things that apply to an eved ivri that do not apply to an amma ivriya. And then it made a list. What was the list? That in every eved ivri goes out after 6 years, goes out by Yovel, goes out by the death of the master. And it makes it sound like none of these things apply to an amma ivriya. Or mini, but 1 second, Yisera alav amma ivriya, shekona asa b'simanin. We'll say beforehand we learned that an amma ivriya has something additional over an eved ivri. What does she have that's additional? That she goes out with simanim. Now we'll say, when you say that an amma ivriya has something additional over an eved ivri, what does that mean? What does that mean? That she could avail herself of all of the avenues of redemption that an eved ivri has. She has something additional, right? So we'll say, so what does that make? So what does that sound like? Whatever an eved ivri could go out, she could go out as well. And in addition to all of those avenues, she also goes out with simanim. So yet here the brisa seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, that again she doesn't have the same avenues of redemption. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, what's the case over here? The case over here, we'll say, is where he performed yiyud. Now, we're going to discuss this a little bit more in depth in just a few moments. The concept of yiyud, Rabbi say, essentially is a Kiddushin, right? In other words, remember, part of the whole concept of selling a girl as an Amma Ivriya is with the intention that the master is going to marry her. That's the goal. And the fact is, it's actually built into the system, meaning what? That remember, when the master marries the girl, he doesn't have to give her additional kesef Kiddushin. We're going to see this. Rather, again, so how do they affect Kiddushin? With the purchase money. The purchase money itself is transformed into kesef Kiddushin. So the Gemara is suggesting over here as follows. And again, we'll discuss exactly how yiyud is accomplished. What the Gemara is suggesting is, once the master does yiyud with the Amma Ivriya, she is no longer emancipated through the aforementioned mechanisms, right? So if the master dies, right, master dies, fine, that's something different, right? But Lamaisa, she doesn't go out after 6 years, right? She does all these other things, she doesn't go out. The only way she goes out after yiyud is with a get. So the Gemara says, Seyada pshita kita baya. That's obvious. Once there's yiyud, right? Once there's yiyud, ultimately again, once there is yud, the only way to get out of that is going to be with a get. So madatema, lo libat lihilchas samina, you might have thought that even with yud, perhaps all of the other avenues of emancipation still apply to her. Kamashmala, no. Kamashmala, they do not. Ihachi amayotza bisimanim. If that's the case, ultimately, again, then why would she go out with signs of physical maturation? Hachi kamar imlo yaada yotze af bisimanim. What it means to say is like this: if he did not perform yiyud, then she goes out with simanim. So we'll say a very important halacha. So what we are learning is as follows: an Amma Ivriya goes out in all of the same ways that an Eved Ivri does. The only exception, of course, that she does, in other words, she goes out after 6 years, she goes out with the death of the master. The only thing that she doesn't have is what? Is Yovel, right? Because she doesn't get pierced, right? Amma Ivriya doesn't get pierced. But besides that, and she has one additional mechanism in Simanim. The only thing the Gemara is introducing us to now is after there is Yiyud, right? So that affects, we'll see whether it affects Kiddushin or Nisun. We're going to talk about that. After there is Yiyud, so ultimately, again, obviously she's not going out with these things because now this is transformed into a marital situation, and the only way to dissolve that marital bond is going to be with a get. Okay, so the Gemara goes right to ve'enon im kares v'nishnis, an Amma Ivriya cannot be sold and resold. So michlal de eved ivri nimkar v'nishna. So also you can infer from this Could infer from this that an Eved Ivri can be sold and resold. Right? In other words, if you tell me that an Am Ivriya can't be sold and resold, I guess an Eved Ivri can be sold and resold. So the Gemara says, V'atanya we learned, Bigneva Sovalo Bigfelo. So once again, we learned, this is actually a lot of interesting halachas over here, Bigneva So. But remember again, when are you selling an Eved Ivri? So remember again, we saw there are two cases. There's Mocheres Atzmo, an Eved who sells himself. When is an Eved selling himself? When is that? He's destitute, right? And then there's Nimkar Beis Din, right? He's sold by Beis Din. What does Beis Din sell him? He stole an item, can't repay the stolen item. We sell him in order to work off that debt. So the Gemara says, you sell a bigneva, so because of his debt, velo bikfelo. Very interesting. Let's say, remember again, certain cases of theft generate an obligation for kefal. Kefal, I will say, is a penalty payment. Penalty payment, right? Or again, it can be arba v'chamisha if you steal a sheep or an ox, right? So again, interestingly enough, the only time you sell an eved is when he can't pay back principal. If he can't pay back penalty payments, we do not go ahead and sell him for that. Bigneva sovelos bizmamo. We'll say ultimately, again, you only sell an eved ultimately if what? For his theft and not for hazama. Right? For example, let's say he lied. We'll say there's a concept by Edim Zoman of reciprocal punishment. Right? If witnesses show up and they say that Ruvain is obligated to pay Shimon $1,000, and it turns out that they're lying, so reciprocal punishment says the witnesses themselves have to pay $1,000. Reciprocal punishment does not apply when you're testifying that someone was a slave, an Eved Ivri. An Eved Ivri. You don't sell that person as a slave. Okay? Basically, Gemara says, Bigneva so, Kevan Shnimkar Pam Achos, Shuv Iyatara Shenamocher. Furthermore, Pasuk says you sell him for his theft, but once you sold him once for his theft, you can't resell him. So you see from here that it's not just an Amma Ivriya who's not sold and resold, but rather even a regular Eved Ivri can't be sold more than once. Amaravalo Kashya. So what's going on over here? So it sounds like before an Eved Ivri can be sold more than once, and now you're saying that an Eved Ivri can't be sold more than once. What's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Amaravalo Kashya, Kan Bigneva Achos, Kan Bishtei Gnevos. One is talking about one act of theft, and one is talking about two acts of theft. For one act of theft, you can't be sold more than once. For two independent acts of theft, you can be sold more than once. Amalei Abaye, Bigneva so, Tuva Mashma. Abaye says this is even inherent to the that Bigneva so doesn't have to just mean one act of theft. It can even include multiple acts of thefts. Ela Amra Abaye, Lokasha, Kan Be'adam Echad, Kan Bishnei B'nei Adam. So Abaye says, listen to this, it's very interesting. Abaye says, here's what the pasuk going to teach me. Abaye say, if I steal from Ruvain multiple times, right? I can only be sold once for one act of theft per person. So even if I stole multiple items or multiple times, right? It's not really items. If I stole from Reuven multiple times, I can only be sold once. If, however, I steal from multiple people, then Einachinami, I can be sold multiple times. That's the distinction. So Tanabanon, Gnevo Elev V'Shava Chamishmas. What's the interesting case over here? Let's say I stole $1,000. I'm only worth 500. I'm only worth 500. So let's say what happens over here. This is not good for the ego, right? I stole $1,000, but I'm only worth 500. So what's halacha? So nimkar v'chozer v'nimkar. So the Brisa says you can be sold and resold. In other words, so we'll say what that means is 12 years. 12 years, right? I'll go ahead. I'll be sold 6 years for 500, and then another 6 years for another 500 to pay off the debt. Gnevo chamesh me'os v'shava elef. We'll say what happens if the opposite? I only stole 500, right? Or I stole an item worth, and I could be sold for 1,000. For 1,000, eno nimkar klal. In that case, you're not sold at all. Not sold at all. So in other words, if my value eclipses the value of the item stolen, I'm not stolen at all. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Em hayagnevo kineged nimkar nimkar, ve'em lav eno nimkar. Suppose Rabbi Eliezer says no. The only time you sell someone a bosei is if there is a direct relationship between amount stolen and value of the person. So if I could be sold for the value of the item, then einachinami, there's servitude. If there's any differential, either I'm worth more, the item is worth more, Rabbi Eliezer says there's no sale of an Eved Ivri in that case. Amar Rava. So the Gemara says, Baha Zichanu Rabbi Eliezer l'Rabbanon. In this case, Rabbi Eliezer, his position is shown to be more correct than the Rabbanon's. How so? Demai shna gnevo chamesh meos shava elef de'ein nimkar, the nimkar kula amrachma v'lo chatzio. Why is it in a case of Osai, where ultimately, right, a stolen object is worth 500, and I'm worth 1,000. Why am I not sold in that scenario? Because I will say the pasuk says ultimately v'nimkar b'gneva, so you will be sold. But it only works if all of you is sold, not if half of you is sold. Hachanami sotzra will say again, nimkar b'gneva so amrachmana v'lo nimkar b'chatzi gneva so. The same applies in the other direction as well. If at the end of the day I stole 1,000 and I'm worth 100 and I'm worth 500, so the Maisa to sell me to only satisfy half of the stolen requirement doesn't apply either. So I will say in this respect, Rabbi Eliezer seems to be correct. That is interesting that halacha l'maisa, the concept of selling someone to satisfy the debt of something that was stolen only works when there is a direct correlation between amount stolen and purchase price for the Eved Ivri. Rabbi Eliezer says if there's any level of differential, I will say obviously it has to be that there's always some level of differential, but what it means is when you're in the ballpark, right? When you're in the ballpark, then ultimately again it works. But if not, halacha l'maisa, we do not sell. Incredible. Umaftin osa bal karcha. So bal karchos. Remember again, the Raisa said, we redeem the Amavriya even against his will. So we'll say, of course, the shaila is, whose will are we talking about over here? So Savar Rav Lamimar bal karche da adon. So Rav thought it must mean against the will of the master. That even if the master does not want her to leave, we could redeem her against his will. Amalei Abaye, Mainiu, how do you do that? How do you do that? So I guess what that means is we go over to the owner and we write the owner a promissory note, right? And I owe you here, the Amma is worth $1,000. Here's the shtar, I owe you $1,000 now. Amma, you're free to go. So amai nakit marginisa biyadei yahivna leich. Sorry. So amai nakit marginisa biyadei yahivna leichasba. So why would the adon ever agree to this? Right. So the adon owns an item of value, i.e., the amma. So now he's supposed to literally translated. He has a jewel, all right, a pearl in his hand. He's going to give away the pearl for a piece of clay, or as we'll say, then I owe you, and I owe you. A promissory note is very nice. It's very nice. What is it worth? What is it worth? Right? The paper it's written on. So he's going to give up an item of value because somebody gave him a promissory note. That doesn't seem to be that's in the Adon's best interest. Amar Abaye bal karche da'av. Bal karche, I will say, by the way, it's also that expression is so beautiful. Nakit marginisa biyadei yahivne lechasba. Sometimes you have, right, the precious pearl in your hand and you're willing to give it away, ultimately, again, for clay. So if you think about it again, each of us has that beautiful jewel, that beautiful marganisa in the neshama. And how often are we willing to go ahead and give away the neshama for some immediate temporal pleasure or some immediate temporal benefit that doesn't last, that loses its luster after you enjoy it. And meanwhile, I've compromised the beautiful pearl of my neshama for some type of fleeting pleasure. Such a profound statement. So rather, again, Amar Abaye says, Bal karche da'av. It means that we can redeem the daughter, right, to redeem the Amavriya against the will of the father. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi Bal karche da'av im yesh lo kofin lo upoda osa. So we'll say, so now remember again, the whole chapai Amavriya is that the concept is to redeem her, right, to redeem her. Let's say the father has money, but he doesn't want to redeem her. Whatever the reason, he doesn't want to redeem her. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says we could force the father to redeem his daughter. Why? Mishum pegam mishpacha. Because I will say it's not nice for the family. As one could imagine, again, a family that has a daughter who's an Amma Ivriya, this is not appropriate. Right? This is not the Jewish family. Again, I will say, selling your daughter as an Amma Ivriya, as much as there's a mechanism for it, Halacha provides mechanisms for a lot of things. As much as we provide the mechanism, this is not the preferred route. Right? This is the route of desperation. So, Father, if you have money, you better redeem your daughter right now. now. And ultimately, again, if he refuses, we force him. If that's the case, then why is this only by Am Ivriya? Why not by Eved Ivri also? If the family has money to redeem him, why not force them to redeem him? Here's the difference. Hadr azul umizabin nafshe. See, by an Eved Ivri, what we're concerned about is that if we force the family to redeem him, what's going to happen? Right after redemption, what is he going to do? He's going to resell himself. Now we'll say, why would he resell himself? Because who gets the money if he resells himself? He does. So this is a fantastic, quick money-making scheme. Force your family to redeem you, then go ahead and resell yourself. And if every single time we have to force the family, again, that puts them in an uncomfortable, untenable situation. The Gemara says, so why are we concerned about sitting with the Amma Ivriya? That we're going to force the father to redeem her, and she's going to resell herself. To which we said before, the Gemara says, no, but an Amma Ivriya is different. Why? We're saying Amma Ivriya cannot be sold the second time. So therefore, Allah, when it says we force him to redeem her, the him is her father, because it is a black cloud upon the family, ultimately, again, to have this daughter, to have their daughter as an Amma Ivriya. Incredible. Umani, we'll say, whose opinion is this? This Rabbi Shimon he. Disanya mocher adam espito liishos v'shona. So the Gemara says, this reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, ultimately, again, a father could go ahead and sell his daughter, L'ishus v'shona, and repeat. Again, we'll discuss what that means in just a moment. L'shifchos v'shona, he could also sell his daughter as a maidservant and sell her a second time. L'ishos achar shifchos, right? Ultimately, again, avalo l'shifchos achar ishos. He could give her away in marriage. After, ultimately, again, she's been sold as a shifcha, but she cannot give her away as a shifcha after she has been married. It says, the same way that a man cannot sell his daughter for a shifcha after she's been married, so too a father cannot resell his daughter for servitude after she has already been an Amma Ivriya. And about saying reality, it's a machlokes tanam. What do we learn? This sign about listen to this. We learned in a brayso, bevigdo ba. Shabbos says, so remember the pasuk over here is imra'a be'enei adonai asher lo yada. So this is Amma Ivriya. If the Amma Ivriya does not find favor in the eyes of her master, who did not do yud with her, vehafda, redeem her, li'am nachri lo yimshal machra. Do not sell her to a foreign nation. Bevigdo ba. What does that phrase mean? Bevigdo ba. This time bevigdo ba. We'll say Amud Beis, Yud Ches Amud Beis 18b. Kevin shepirish taliso aleha shuv ein rashay lemachar div Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva will say bevigdo ba. Here it says bevigdo literally means a beged. Bevigdo ba means if the master extends his beged, extends his garment over the Amma Ivriya. So we'll say, what's the metaphor of extending your beged? Marriage, right? Represents the husband, right, taking his wife underneath his cloak. So bevigdo ba, if at the end of the day he extends his cloak over his wife, or over the Amma, shuv ein rashay lemachra. He cannot go ahead and sell her anymore. Because essentially once there's yud, Rabbosai, the entire marriage or the entire relationship has now transformed into a marital one. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, bevigdo ba, Kevan shebagad ba shuv ein rashay lemachra. Rabbi Eliezer says once he has bagad, I want to say bagad means rebelled against her. Rabbi Eliezer say, what does it mean rebelled against her? Rebelled against her means he's decided that he no longer wants to marry her. He does not want to do yud. Once he decides he does not want to do yud, ultimately, again, he has no right to sell her anymore. So an interesting idea over here. So what's the machlokes? Rabbi Akiva, so the Gemara said, so we'll say, it's fascinating just to see, you see over here how they are interpreting the same phrase in such dramatically different ways. Bevigdo ba. So the Torah is telling us that at the end of the day, this Adon, this master, is not permitted to sell her. Rather, he has to help her with redemption. So bevigdo ba. What does it mean bevigdo ba? So once again, so first opinion says, Rabbi Akiva says, once he has extended his beged over her, ultimately he cannot sell her, which is yiyud. Rabbi Eliezer says, once he has rebelled against her, bevigdo, bagad means to rebel, ultimately again, he cannot sell her anymore, meaning he doesn't want to marry her, he can't sell her. What are they arguing about? Rabbi Eliezer savar, yesh aim lamasoras. Rabbi Eliezer says, ultimately, when you look at a word in the Torah, we give primacy, right? We give precedence, ultimately, to the way the word is written. To the way the word is written. Shabbos says, so ultimately, again, when you look at the way the word is written, it's written of, right, bevigdo, right, rebel, right? Rabbi Akiva savar yeshem lemikra. Rabbi Akiva says, no, we ultimately focus on how you read it, right? And since ultimately, again, it's read as if it has a yud, bevigdo, so ultimately, again, we read it ultimately as just the opposite. Yesh Eim L'Masores means ultimately, again, we go ahead and we assign primacy to how it is written. Rabbi Akiva says Yesh Eim L'Mikra, ultimately, again, we give primacy to how it is read. Rabbi Shimon holds Yesh Eim L'Mikra or L'Masores. We actually give primacy to both the way it is written as well as the way that it's read. So therefore, again, how do you go ahead and look at the word bevigdo? So Rabbi Akiva will say, we look at it at the end of the day as beged, right? Ultimately, again, as a garment. Rabbi Eliezer will say, bevigdo, bagad, as an act of rebellion. Fascinating machlokis over here. So also, I'll just tell you, there's a beautiful idea. Rabbi Nachman of Breslau says this. We've seen this machlokis many times of yesh eim lemikra, yesh eim lemasoras. Sometimes you have certain words, and do we look at how they are written, or do we look at how they are read, how they're enunciated? So Rabbi Nachman says, if you look at that phrase, yesh eim lemikra, so the Rebbe says that in Chasidus, the Shechina itself is often referred to as a mother. Actually, you saw it not so long ago. We saw by the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKein, sending away the mother bird, right? Shaleach tishalach es ha'em. The mother is often referred, ultimately, the Shechina, right? The divine presence is often referred to as the mother. So the Rebbe says in that phrase, yesh eim lemikra, there is always a mother to call out to. Yesh eim lemikra, right? Ultimately, again, if you want to call out, the mother is always there. The Shechina is always there. There's sometimes in life we go through life and we encounter certain times, we encounter certain events, and we think that sometimes the Shechina is not listening to us. Sometimes the Shechina, the Rebbe Shalom, is not close to us. Maybe he's left us for a variety of different reasons. It's not true. Says Rabbi Nachman, Yesh eim lemikra. There is always a mother who is available when you are ready to call out to her. There is always a God who is attentive and ready to listen at any time that we need him. So beautiful. And it says, so halacha l'maisa machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer about ultimately what's happening in this pasuk. Is it saying that once you perform yiyud, you can't sell her? Or is it saying that no, once you don't perform yiyud, you can't sell her? Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, and ultimately again, all comes down to how you read that word bevigdo. Does it mean an act of spreading out a beged, or does it mean an act of rebelling by failing to marry her? Yesh eim lemikra, yesh eim lemasoras. Incredible. Let's go back there. So we'll say, so now we get to the thrust of this question. Yiyud nisuin osa or erisin osa. So we'll say, what does yiyud accomplish? What does yiyud accomplish? Now we'll say, now what is yiyud? So actually, if you take a look at Rashi, this is Rashi in the short, right before the lines get wide, 2, 4, 6 lines before the lines get wide. Yiyud. So we'll say, watch this. Amar li amaso ha'ivriya, hari'at Yehuda li bekesef miknasech. Here it is, Rashi spells it out. So remember again, just the process would be like this, right? Ruvain purchases an Amma Ivriya, a Jewish maidservant, right? From her father, right? So Rachel is being sold by her father as an Amma Ivriya. Not good, we've already established that, but he's doing that. Now what happens? Ruvain pays whatever it is, $1,000. Now at some point in time, Reuven decides, you know what? I want to marry this woman. So what does he do? He goes over to Rachel. He says, Rachel, Hari'at, and the Lashon over is very interesting. Hari'at Yeudali. You are yield to me with the purchase money. So the purchase money itself transforms into kesef kiddushin, and ultimately, again, that's how you affect yud. Now, we'll say the fundamental shaila is, what does yud do? Does yud affect nisuin? Like, is yud full marriage, or is yud just kiddushin? So the Gemara said nafkamina. We'll say we know the nafkaminas: liyarsha, letamela, or lahafer nedara. So we'll say, of course, there are major nafkaminas. Let's say Reuven himself is a kohen. Now he did yud with Rachel. And now Rachel dies. Is he allowed to become tummy for her if he's a kohen? Does he go ahead and inherit her? And does he have the ability ultimately to annul her vows? All legitimate questions. So Tashma, let's analyze. Bivig doba, positive video akevan, shepiresh talisa aleha, shuv ena rashay lemachra. Ultimately, again, so we'll say salocha lemaisa, once he spread out his talis over, he did yud, he no longer has the ability to sell her. Fine. So the Gemara says, "Zevuni hu delom hasbin lei." He can't sell her. Hayude miyaed lei. But yet, ultimately, again, yiyud does have the ability to be accomplished. V'i amrit nisuin osa. Now, if at the end of the day you say that yiyud accomplishes nisuin, kevan denises shuv ein la v'erushuspa. Once she is married, her father no longer has any rishus over here. Her elalav shmamina erisinosa. Rather, we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa yiyud does not affect nisuin. Rather, yiyud just affects erisin. Just affects erisin. Amrav Nachar Yitzchak hacha b'kiddushin da'almakoi. Here we're just talking about actually regular Kiddushin. We're not talking about Amma Ivriya. What it means to say, Kevan shemasra aviha lemishin es chaye b'sherik susa va'onasa. We'll say it's talking about a stam case. Once the father gives over his daughter in Kiddushin to a man, ultimately again who is obligated to care and support her, shuv in yochel mochra. Father no longer has the ability to sell her as an Amma Ivriya. So I will say, fine. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here that the Bryce that we're talking about is not even talking about Amma Ivriya, so much just a case of Kiddushin. Tashma, so we'll say, therefore, we're still left with our fundamental question, which is, what does Yud accomplish? Does Yud accomplish Erisin and Nisuin? Right? Or perhaps it is just Erisin, just Kiddushin. So Tashma, Ein Mochra, the Krovim, was an actually interesting case. A father can't sell his daughter as an Amma Ivriya to relatives. Why not? Why not? So the Gemara will say, because Bepashtos, part of the goal with selling your daughter as an Amma Ivriya is what? That ultimately the master should ultimately marry her. So therefore, if you marry her off to relatives, marriage becomes impossible. So therefore, the Gemara says, ideally, do not go ahead and sell her to relatives. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you could even go ahead and sell her to relatives. The Shavin, everyone agrees, shemochra almana lekohen gadol, grusha vechalutza lekohen hedyot. So I'll say everyone agrees that you could sell a daughter who is an almana to a kohen gadol, or a daughter who is divorced or a chalutza to a regular kohen. I'm both saying, now what's the chap? A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an Almana, right? A regular Kohen can't marry a Grusha. We'll say, but what happens if they do? Kiddushin works. Remember again, we paskin Kiddushin tovsin b'chayvei lavin. That although it is always usher, if you have a specific union that is punishable by a lav, ultimately again, the marriage will work. So we'll say, which still bears something interesting. So when we say you can't marry her off to relatives, those are relatives whom she cannot marry. If she tries to marry Kiddushin, will not work. But technically speaking, if you marry her off to, or you give her you sell her as an Amma Ivriya, ultimately to someone with whom Kiddushin is usher, but it'll still work, the sale is valid. So the Gemara says, one second, let's analyze this. So this is an interesting statement. So a father can't sell his daughter, who is an almana, right, to a Kohen Gadol, or a grusha to a Kohen Hedyot. What's that case? Hi almana hechi dami. What's the case of the daughter who's an almana? Ilema de kaddish nafsha. If you say she accepted Kiddushin on her own, that can't be. Almana karila. Also remember again, we're talking about a girl who has to be a kitana, an ara kitana, because otherwise the father can't sell her as an amma. So if she was that young and she accepted Kiddushin on her own, such a Kiddushin will be irrelevant. The ela de kidsha avia. Rather, it has to be a case where her father accepted Kiddushin, and apparently she was widowed or divorced. Mi matzi masbila. But if the father accepted Kiddushin for her once, then Allah Chalamaisa will say what? Father doesn't have the ability to sell her afterwards. After all, we learned, Vaha Ein Adam Mocher es Bito L'Shivchas Achar Ishus. So we already learned that what? That Allah Chalamaisa, father doesn't have the right to sell his daughter as an Amma after she's already been married. So we'll say it must be Rav Amsa and Rabbi Yitzchak. What are we talking about? Well, ultimately, again, there was Kiddushin through Yiyud, there was Kiddushin through Yiyud, and what? And according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar, Ma'os Harishonos Lav L'Kiddushin Nitnu. And ultimately, again, he holds that the original monies tendered, ultimately, again, are not given for Kiddushin purposes. V'i Amrit Nisuin Osa, Kevan Shenises Shuv Ein Lavia Rushusba. So I will say, and if you were to say that halacha l'maisa, Yiyud affects Nisuin, then I will say once that happens, the father no longer has any rights to her, would not be able to go ahead and marry her off for Salah Zama subsequently. The Ella Mai Erisin Osa. Rather, I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that at most what Yiyud does is Erisin. So Rabbi say, so the Gemara seems to feel, based on that last case, that Allah Chalamaisa, again, at most what Yiyud is going to affect is Erisin. So essentially, again, Yiyud kind of becomes it's a Kiddushin. It's a Kiddushin, which also, Rabbi say, seems to intuitively make sense, because what is he doing? He's taking the money that was given ultimately, again, for a purchase and saying that money should be transformed into Kiddushay Yiyud. So it sounds like, again, it really is a same thing as a Kiddushin process. So we're going to stop over here for today. We'll stop here. So again, we're leaving off in the middle of the question, what does Yiyud do? Everyone agrees Yiyud will do something. The shaila is, does it just do Kiddushin, and therefore Nisuin is going to be required afterwards, or perhaps it affects both Kiddushin and Nisuin? And Mirat Hashem, resolution tomorrow, Shkoyach. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone.
Quick question. Miyun is when the brothers do it, right? The brothers or the mother. In other words, she could refuse. Miyun.
Miyun is correct. Miyun is when she is in a rabbinic marriage through mothers or brother, and she could just simply